Most people don't leave behind a warning. They leave behind photographs, old text messages, birthday videos, memories that only seem important after they're gone. Sara Gilson left behind something different. She looked straight into a camera, walked calmly across the room, sat down in an empty chair, clasped her hands together, and let the silence do most of the talking. There were no tears, no dramatic music, no frantic plea for help. Just a few words that, at the time, probably looked like another social media trend. Preparing for when Netflix drops a documentary about my soon-to-be ex-husband, who I just found out is a pedophile. She ended the caption with 4 words that, only days later, would haunt thousands of strangers. I wish I was joking. When she uploaded that TikTok on 11 July 2026, no one knew they were watching what would become one of the last public messages she would ever post. 12 days later, a child dialed 911 from inside Sara's home in Owasso, Oklahoma. Police say Sara Gilson had been shot. Investigators say the man responsible was her estranged husband, Shawn Duffey, who then died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Suddenly, that short TikTok wasn't just another video. People replayed it over and over, searching for clues hidden in her expression. Had she known she was in danger? Was she trying to tell people something? Could anyone have stopped what was about to happen? Those questions spread across social media almost as quickly as the news itself. But the answers weren't hiding inside that TikTok. They were buried in court records, protective orders, police reports, and a chain of decisions that had begun weeks before the shooting. Because by the time Sara pressed post, she had already gone somewhere far more serious than TikTok. She had gone to court. And a judge had already agreed that she needed protection. If you only discovered this case through the viral headlines, it's easy to think the story begins with that TikTok. It doesn't. By then, the marriage was already falling apart. Sara wasn't just an influencer. She was a working hairstylist in Owasso, Oklahoma. Friends described her as someone who filled a room with energy. Online, she shared family moments, fashion finds, and everyday life with more than 20,000 followers. Nothing about her page suggested that strangers would one day know her name because of a homicide investigation. To many viewers, she looked like someone building a normal life. Behind the scenes, that normal life was breaking apart. Sara and Shawn Duffey were separating. Divorce is never simple, but according to court records, this separation had become something much more frightening. On 10 June 2026, Sara asked a court for an emergency protective order. In her filing, she alleged that Duffey had a firearm, had threatened suicide, and had gone on the run. A judge granted the emergency order that same day, requiring him to leave the home and stay at least 100 yards away from her. For many people, that might sound like the moment the danger ended. In reality, experts on domestic violence have long warned that leaving an abusive relationship can be one of the most dangerous periods for a victim. Protective orders can be vital legal tools, but they do not physically prevent someone from ignoring them. At the time, though, no one could know how this story would end. Life continued. Friends worked. Children went about their routines. Videos were posted. The calendar kept moving. And then another development surfaced, one that would dramatically change how people viewed the situation. The same day Sara sought protection, another family went to court. This time, it wasn't about a marriage. It involved a teenage girl. Court records show that a woman filed a protective order on behalf of her 15-year-old daughter, who had played on a youth basketball team coached by Shawn Duffey. According to those court filings, the mother alleged that another coach had witnessed inappropriate physical contact between Duffey and her daughter. The filings also alleged that the teenager later described additional inappropriate behavior, including messages, an invitation to a hotel room during a tournament, and an offer of money to stay quiet. These were serious allegations contained in court documents. At the time of the fatal shooting, they had been publicly reported, but no criminal conviction had been secured regarding them. Still, the allegations added another layer to an already volatile situation, and they help explain why Sara's later TikTok attracted so much attention. because when she used the word pedophile, she wasn't making that statement in isolation. There were already legal proceedings unfolding around her. The public, however, knew almost none of this. Most people scrolling through TikTok weren't reading Tulsa County court filings. They saw only a woman taking part in a viral trend. What they didn't see was everything happening outside the frame. If you've ever watched a crime documentary, you know there's often a moment that changes everything. Not because anyone notices it at the time, but because everyone notices it afterwards. Sara's TikTok became that moment. After her death, viewers began studying it frame by frame. Some focused on her expression, others noticed how still she sat. Some wondered whether she looked frightened. The truth is, we can't know what she was thinking in those few seconds. What we do know is that her words were real. Her protective order was real. The court proceedings were real. And less than 2 weeks later, investigators say she would be dead. That is the part of this story that still leaves people asking the same question. If the courts had already recognized the danger, if a protective order was already in place, how did everything unravel anyway? The answer isn't found in one dramatic moment. It's found in a series of events that, taken together, paint a picture far more unsettling than any headline ever could. Because while the internet was only beginning to notice Sara Gilson, the legal system had already been hearing her voice, and what happened next would turn those warnings into one of the most talked about true crime cases of the summer. By the time most people learned Sara Gilson's name, they knew her because of a single TikTok. But that video wasn't the beginning of her story. Long before it became evidence of a life cut short, Sara was simply trying to build a future. She was a hairstylist in Owasso, Oklahoma, balancing work, raising her children, and sharing pieces of her everyday life online. Her TikTok wasn't filled with crime or controversy. Instead, it featured the kinds of posts many creators share: family moments, fashion, jewelry promotions, and the ordinary routines that connected her with more than 21,000 followers. To the people who knew her personally, she was more than a social media account. Friends described her as energetic, hardworking, and deeply devoted to her 2 sons. She was the kind of person who poured herself into her work and wanted to create a stable life for her family. But while her public life appeared ordinary, her private life was becoming increasingly difficult. Sara and her husband, Shawn Duffey, were no longer building a future together. They were in the middle of a separation, and according to court records, Sara believed the situation had become serious enough to seek legal protection. On 10 June 2026, she filed an application for an emergency protective order in Tulsa County. In that filing, Sara told the court that Duffey had a firearm, had threatened suicide, and had gone on the run. She asked the court for immediate protection. A judge granted the emergency order that same day. Duffey was ordered to leave the home and remain at least 100 yards away from Sara. Less than 2 weeks later, on 23 June, the court extended that protective order through 24 August. For many people, a protective order represents a measure of safety. It creates legal boundaries and gives law enforcement additional authority if those boundaries are crossed. But a court order cannot physically prevent someone from ignoring it. That reality has become one of the most painful aspects of many domestic violence cases. Legal protections can be essential, yet they are not always enough to stop violence from occurring. As Sara was navigating the legal process, another development emerged, one that would later draw national attention. On the very same day Sara sought her protective order, a separate application was filed by another family. This time, it involved a 15-year-old girl who had played on a youth basketball team coached by Duffey. According to court filings, the girl's mother alleged that another coach witnessed inappropriate physical contact between Duffey and her daughter. The filing also stated that the teenager later described additional alleged behavior, including messages, an invitation to a hotel room during a tournament, and an offer of money to remain quiet. These were allegations presented in court documents and later reported by multiple news organizations. At the time of the fatal shooting, there had been no criminal conviction relating to those allegations. Although the two protective order cases were separate, They unfolded at the same time and were both extended by the court on 23 June. For Sara, those weeks were marked by legal proceedings, uncertainty, and an effort to protect herself while moving forward with her life. What wasn't visible to the public was the emotional weight of living through that process. Leaving a marriage is rarely simple. When legal proceedings, protective orders, and serious allegations become part of that process, every day can feel unpredictable. Yet even as those court cases continued, Sara maintained a presence online. Her followers saw posts that looked much like the ones she had always shared. There was little to suggest that, behind the scenes, she was navigating one of the most difficult periods of her life. Then, on 11 July, she uploaded the TikTok that would later be viewed in a completely different light. At the time, it blended into a popular social media trend. After her death, it became one of the most discussed pieces of evidence in the public conversation surrounding the case. The words she chose would soon be replayed by millions, not because they explained everything that happened, but because they hinted at fears that only became fully understood after tragedy struck. The final days of Sara Gilson's life would leave investigators reconstructing a timeline, her family searching for answers, and the public asking whether more could have been done before the violence occurred. By mid-July, Sara Gilson was living through two very different realities. One was public, the other was unfolding quietly through the legal system. Online, she was still the same creator her followers had come to know. She shared pieces of everyday life and continued posting to TikTok, where thousands of people followed her content. But away from social media, court proceedings were still active. The protective order she had obtained remained in effect. Under the court's order, Shawn Duffey was required to stay away from her and remain outside the 100-yard exclusion zone established by the judge. To those following her online, none of that was immediately visible. Then, on 11 July 2026, Sara posted a short video that would later take on an entirely different meaning. It followed a popular social media trend in which people jokingly imagined themselves being interviewed for a future documentary. Sara walked into view, sat down in an empty chair, and looked towards the camera. The text on the screen read, "Preparing for when Netflix drops a documentary about my soon-to-be ex-husband, who I just found out is a pedophile." The caption beneath the video added, "I wish I was joking." At the time, viewers had little context beyond those words. Some may have interpreted it as part of the trend itself. Others may have recognized that it reflected something deeply personal. Only later, after news of her death spread, did many people begin connecting that post with the court records that had already been filed weeks earlier. The video quickly circulated beyond her own audience. News organizations referenced it while reporting on the case, and social media users revisited it as they tried to understand the timeline of events. For many, the clip became symbolic of a question that often arises after acts of domestic violence. How much warning can exist before tragedy, and how often are those warnings recognized only in hindsight? The available court records show that Sara had already taken legal action before posting the video. They also show that a separate protective order involving allegations concerning a teenage basketball player had been filed independently around the same time. Those were significant developments. But they did not answer the question that many people were asking after the shooting: what happened in the days that followed? Publicly available reporting provides only a limited picture of that period. There is no complete account of every conversation, every interaction, or every decision made between 11 July and the night of 23 July. What is known comes primarily from court records, statements from investigators, and reporting by established news organizations. According to investigators, that sequence came to a tragic conclusion on the evening of 23 July. A child inside Sara's home placed a call to emergency services. When officers arrived, they found Sara Gilson and Shawn Duffey with fatal gunshot wounds. Investigators said Duffey had shot Sara before fatally shooting himself. The deaths transformed what had already been a deeply personal legal dispute into a homicide investigation that attracted national attention. In the days that followed, attention focused not only on what had happened inside the home, but also on the legal history that preceded it. People revisited the protective orders, they revisited the TikTok, and they revisited the warning signs that had become visible only after the tragedy. For Sara's family, friends, and community, however, the case was never just about court filings or viral videos. It was about the loss of a mother, a daughter, a friend, and a woman whose life had extended far beyond the headlines. The investigation would establish what happened inside the home. But for many people, the more difficult questions about prevention, protection, and whether anything could have changed the outcome would remain long after the initial news coverage had faded. When investigators pieced together the evidence, they concluded that the violence ended almost as quickly as it began. According to police, Jeremiah Shawn Duffey fatally shot Sara Gilson before taking his own life. A child inside the home called 911, bringing first responders to a scene that would leave a family and a community forever changed. In the days that followed, attention naturally focused on the details of the investigation. News outlets reported on the active protective order, the court filings, and Sara's now viral TikTok. Each new report added context to a story that had already captured national attention. But behind every headline was a family trying to come to terms with an unimaginable loss. Friends remembered Sara as someone who worked hard, cared deeply for her children, and brought warmth to the people around her. Those who followed her online saw the creator they had watched for months or years. Those who knew her personally mourned the woman behind the videos. As investigators completed their work, another part of the story remained unfinished. Before the fatal shooting, court records had documented separate allegations involving a teenage basketball player whom Duffey had coached. Those allegations had been reported publicly and were the subject of legal proceedings, but no criminal conviction had been secured before his death. As a result, those allegations were never tested through a criminal trial. That reality leaves important questions unanswered. Court filings can reveal what people allege and what they ask the legal system to address, but they are not the same as a criminal verdict. In this case, the homicide ended the possibility of those allegations being resolved in court. For many observers, the case also renewed discussion about domestic violence and the role of protective orders. A protective order is an important legal safeguard that can create enforceable boundaries and provide a basis for police action if those boundaries are violated. At the same time, advocates have long recognized that no legal document can physically prevent every act of violence. Cases like this often prompt communities to reflect on how victims can be supported during periods of heightened risk. It is also a reminder that the lives described in true crime stories are not fictional characters. They are parents, children, friends, and neighbors whose families continue living with the consequences long after public attention moves on. Sara Gilson's final TikTok will likely remain the image many people associate with this case, but it should not be the only thing remembered about her. She was a mother, a hairstylist, a woman who built a following by sharing ordinary moments from her life. Those closest to her remembered her kindness, her determination, and her commitment to her family. Those parts of her story deserve to be remembered alongside the tragedy that brought her name into the headlines. As with many cases involving domestic violence, some questions may never be fully answered. What is known comes from the investigation, court records, and the reporting that followed. Those sources establish a clear timeline of key events, but they cannot fully explain the personal experiences or decisions that unfolded behind closed doors. For the people left behind, however, the focus is no longer on the headlines. It is on remembering a life that mattered. If this story highlights anything, it is the importance of taking concerns about domestic violence seriously, encouraging those at risk to seek support, and recognizing that help is available through local services and trusted people before situations escalate. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary informative, consider subscribing for more carefully researched true crime stories that focus on verified facts, thoughtful storytelling, and the people at the center of each case, not just the headlines.